Hi, I'm Jarrett Fuller. Welcome to Scratching the Surface. I've always been interested in this certain era in architecture history, somewhere I'd loosely peg between the mid-70s and early 80s, when there wasn't much building happening, but architects were engaging with these alternative forms of practice. This is the era of paper architecture. I'm thinking about Rem Koolhaas in Delirious New York, or Daniel Liebeskind's tenure at Cranbrook, or Peter Eisenman's Institute of Architecture and Urban Studies. Many of these architects were skeptical of the profession, were suspicious of building, yet many of them later would go on to build, and some of them would build a lot. What happens to a practice when it moves from theory to building? What's gained and what's lost? How do you translate academic ideas into built artifacts? How do you maintain an intellectual voice working with clients? Listeners may remember Aaron Betsky and I talked through some of these ideas on the show last year. One such practice in this vein that has long captivated my interest is Diller Scofidio and Renfro, the architecture studio founded by Elizabeth Diller and Rick Scofidio in 1981. Early in their partnership, they made a name for themselves in this hard-to-define space between art, architecture, and public space, where they worked on installations, theater sets, and various public interventions. Today, however, they might best be known as the designers of New York's The Highline, or The Shed, the experimental arts and culture space in Hudson Yards, or for rethinking an expansion for MoMA, or for LA's museum The Broad. In the 40 years, the studio grew from Liz and Rick to a large team with two additional partners, Charles Renfro and Benjamin Gilmartin. All of this work, from the experimental performances to the urban planning, is compiled into the studio's first comprehensive monograph, a 2-book set called Architecture, Not Architecture. Designed to be read through a variety of paths, the monograph both collects a wide range of work while also, I think, complicating our understandings of architecture, of design, of art. So with that in mind, I am honored to be joined today by Elizabeth Diller to talk about the monograph itself, but also about the evolution of her practice, going from an art student at Cooper Union in the 1970s who found her way into an architecture class to designing for some of the most complex and bureaucratic clients. How does one move from one to the other? And perhaps more importantly, what has she taken from that early experience that still shapes her work today? This is, I think, a thoughtful conversation about moving from institutional critique to being within institutions, about the relationship between cultural production and problem solving, and about what she tells students entering architecture today. I really admire the way Liz thinks about her work and how she and the studio have navigated building a truly cross-genre practice. If you like the show and what we do here, you can support our work by joining our Substack. We have a monthly newsletter that is free for all, as well as a paid tier that gets you a bonus interview each month and helps keep this show free for everyone. Our paid subscribers truly enable us to do this work and keep the show going. So if you want more of this in the world, please consider signing up and supporting our work. Thank you, as always, for listening, and here is my conversation with Elizabeth Diller. You have this new book out that's the first complete monograph of the studio's work that I've spent a lot of time with over the last couple of weeks. It's called Architecture, Not Architecture. And when I first got the book and saw that it was these sort of two kind of connected but also disconnected books, I was very frustrated by that binary. That didn't feel accurate to me. And then you mention on the first page that binary is a false binary, that you don't actually think about that in the studio. So I felt a little better after I saw that note on the first page. But it got me thinking about how you do think about the range of output in the studio. How has architecture been a way to contain all of these other things that we might traditionally think of as not architecture?
This is something I actually never think about. It's just the nature of the studio. It started that way, perhaps with not architecture through an architectural lens.
Yeah.
That is, all aspects of thinking about space, contemplating space through various media, and not necessarily professional architecture, making buildings with clients uh, and that sort of thing. So the range of output that the studio has is just it's just sort of been complicated by doing actual buildings, along the way. So we've always done architecture just on our own terms, which could mean anything from installations to curatorial projects to projects for print to projects for media
Mhm.
of all sorts. It isn't entirely defined, except that it's through the lens of architects.
I love how you just said that this practice has been complicated by real architecture, by building for clients. That sounds right to me. I want to come back to that. One of the most revealing lines in the book is one of the interviews that you give early on. This is an older interview, and it's talking about your project Bad Press, which was these sort of experimental kind of folded shirts. And the interviewer asks you, according to your conception of architecture, was that project architecture? Was it art? Was it neither? And your answer I find so revealing there. You say, for me, this is a completely straightforward answer. Of course it's architecture. How could it not be? We are architects. And I think that's kind of what you're saying right
Yeah.
now too. And so maybe the question I'm asking is, what does it mean to be an architect? What does architecture mean in that expanded definition that you have operated in for, your entire career?
So maybe I just take a step back for a moment. I was an art student earlier. I wanted to make films, actually. First photography, then films. But then I sort of graduated to thinking about lots of different media. When I took an architecture class as just a little experiment, I was very interested in the discourse, because that wasn't present
Mm,
in the art school. It was kind of anything goes. One didn't have to situate the work historically or
right.
through the discipline. And so I was really attracted to that. But it was Cooper Union, it was John Haydock. He wasn't exactly the model of the professional architect. He was a kind of guru of
Right.
all sorts of channeling lots of 20th century work in all media and also in literature and painting, and his references were all over the place. Thus, the faculty was also really varied. And what I decided to actually get an architecture degree um, because something had happened, something had switched in my brain. I gained a new dimension. So
Mm,
I had I had basically 2D because I was interested in film and uh and I was and photography, but in film brought in time. So that was a third dimension. I didn't think of depth.
I see.
And
Yeah.
so when architecture school brought that in, I realized that actually I could think in 3D in time. And then the other thing that happened along the way, maybe after school, was a kind of realization that I could work in public space and
Mm,
I could affect people's behavior even for a short time.
hmm.
And that just grew into um, things like thinking about parks and
Right.
urban space and then thinking about small buildings and so on. And it's just sort of it was eye-opening for me that I could actually have an idea and realized it. Architecture to me was something that was intellectually bankrupt when I
Right.
stepped in, you know, and
Right.
I thought there was nothing. And then it opened a world of thinking and its own really interesting history and discourse.
You saw exactly where I was taking that question, because I wanted to go back to Cooper Union for a second, and maybe you started answering the question that I was thinking about. You know, you said you got into architecture through photography, filmmaking. You were an art student first. You said that you took a class in architecture. That class was called architectonics. You didn't know what that meant at the time. I've heard you in recent interviews say you still are not totally sure what that meant. And I was trying to figure out what was happening in architecture at Cooper Union that prompted a switch for you from art to architecture. And so it sounds like it wasn't just the the output, but it was also the thought process. It was the theory. It was the reading. Was that was that the original pull? It was actually the ideas. Does that sound
Yeah,
right to you?
yeah, that's absolutely right. In the art school, one made things, and then there was no formal presentation. For example,
Mm,
there was not a time when you explained your work, received criticism publicly for the work. You
mm,
had a relationship with teachers individually, but never in a kind of group setting or more public setting. And what changed also in the architecture school for me was the need to have to speak about the work, the need to
uh,
sort of situate it, in time and space. Um, and as I said, the discipline, like where does it stand in the discipline? Where does it
yeah,
stand in relationship to other thinkers? That may be thinking about the same thing. So it forced me to think harder and to be able and to stand by the work. So it wasn't
hmm,
totally intuitive, it wasn't totally impulsive. There was research involved, and there was analysis involved, and there was critical judgment involved. And I couldn't just get away with making something. I had to explain it and convince people about what it was. And then I had to hear their sometimes harsh criticism. I had to, figure out what to do with that. And I think that was part of the culture
mm,
of an architecture school that I had never really understood and never thought about before. And there was a structured program also. There was some, very simple spatial experiments, initially, then the first program, and then the analysis of a building, of some important building in history. That was extraordinarily important that you spend a semester thinking about something other than what you're making,
mm,
but you take something else like a building in architectural history that you take apart and you bring in your own interpretation, not
right.
necessarily through reading, but just through thinking. And then you represent it in a novel way that speaks to your analytical ideas through the graphics, right? And so that opened up different channels of communication.
So I promise we won't spend this whole conversation talking about Cooper Union and your architecture education, but I'm struck by what you just said there about being able to defend your ideas, being able to respond to something. This sort of the architecture practice was intellectually bankrupt. You graduated with a thought that you were not going to become an architect, and you've described your early practice with Rick, your partner, Rick Scofidio, in the late 70s, early 80s, before as thinking that was really without clients. You've called it a independent spatial practice. How did studying architecture influence that early work? You were in school, you had these things you had to defend, you had to make arguments, you had the schedule of critiques. And then you go out on your own, you and Rick start doing this work that is already hard to categorize.
Right.
How did you build that structure for yourself, I guess is the question that I'm asking. How did you actually think about realizing that early work?
And I'm trying to think back at, was there a plan? I don't
Mm,
think there was
yeah.
ever a plan. So when when I got my degree, now what? Rick had a practice that he was leaving,
Hmm.
that he was very dissatisfied with. There were some dribblings of projects, and um, I started to work with him on those projects, maybe for a year, and then I had a half a year in Rome,
Right.
thinking about just having a project, like what is a project
Hmm.
really
Hmm.
in a broader way. And when I came back, we started to, um, we were very networked into the art scene and had a lot of colleagues and friends. This was really in from the late 70s, and early 80s, um, that I was more interested in what in what was happening, what Trisha Brown was doing than my colleague architects, right? So I we started to be invited to do installations like Creative Time, for example, or creation production companies, theater group, experimental theater group, that asked us to do some projects. And because we have the knowledge of making, building things, that it was very easy in a way because we were able to build our own things in our studio and or have them built. And we understood how to realize projects
Yeah.
that were adventurous. And when we started doing those things, they actually situated us in New York in the context of a pretty tough city,
Hmm.
with a lot of public oversight,
Yeah. Yeah.
and we started to receive comments and so forth. And it got to be sort of natural. I have to say that, one of the very, very, very first projects, that's also the first project in the book, was Traffic.
Yep.
And I believe it was 81, and it just came back from Rome. And the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies had a little competition to propose something that could be done at Columbus Circle. And there was going to be new construction there, the demolition of one of the buildings that was there, and a kind of query into, well, what should happen there on this circle. And mostly everyone responded with an architectural response, like the new building should
Yeah.
hug the circle, in the sort of framework of um, uh, a Roman city or something like that, to make
Yeah.
a piazza. We just sort of embraced the notion that it was a traffic circle with a lot of traffic islands, and tried to do it through temporary means by
Yeah.
distributing these 2,500 international orange traffic cones there, in that, to sort of fuse the space just for 24 hours. And that kind of thing gave me hope that I could do something in public space, and make a difference. And for that day, it made a huge difference. But it was very, very public, and I had
Right. Right.
never really thought about it. Of course, when they did that competition, they weren't really serious about building anything, and there was nothing to build. We just arranged 2,500 traffic
Right.
cones. It was really the popular project among all that was shown. So we got to do it. But just coming back to the draw, I think that the draw was understanding that depth could be added to time and
Yeah.
space and 2D. There was this publicness, that started to appear, and I really loved it. I loved that we were out there and there was a response. And whether it was a theater setting
Hmm.
or an exhibition setting or an installation setting or anything like that. And it didn't have the delay of architecture where you have a thought, you
Right.
work on it for a couple of years, you build it, and then, 5 years later, there's a response. So the immediacy of the work was really a draw.
This has me thinking about something that I would love to kind of hear a theory of mine that I would love to put to you and see if this sounds right to you. You had a successful practice doing this sort of experimental work. There was a show at the Whitney. You were known in these sort of avant-garde, sort of adjacent architecture circles. And as I was looking at this new book, I was thinking about other binaries, other false binaries that could describe your practice. And there's a change that happens in New York post 9/11, in New York architecture, but also in your practice specifically, where suddenly you're getting, quote unquote, to go back to your term before, real building projects. You're doing Lincoln Center, the Highline happens. And it seems like you go very quickly from no clients or these sort of kind of self-generated experimental projects to the biggest clients you can imagine. You know, many people have a stake in these projects. And so there's this weird binary of no clients, all the clients, you know, everybody has an opinion on this. How did that happen? Was that something you were interested in? And how did all of that experimental temporary work actually prepare you for these large sort of urban projects?
George, you're making me think about the past.
I'm
This may
sorry.
be
We'll
no,
get
no,
we'll get more recent in a second.
no. This is very good because it didn't quite get into the book. Those the realizations of exactly what happened, the turning point.
Yeah.
When that happened. And you're right. It was just a little before 9/11, but 9/11 had something to do with it. Um, so at around 1999, 2000. We were uh, put on a list for the Boston ICA.
Mm.
And it was by a historian. There was a long list of 30 architects on that list. And this was to be the first museum that we would have done. So the first serious large commission. And I remember when I met with the client afterwards, she told me the story that, and when she came to a lecture that I did at MIT, it was earlier, it was probably 1999, because there was this list and she was checking everybody out. She heard me speak and she said, "No, these people are not for me." And she sort of closed the door because I was speaking theory speak,
Right.
and I was,
Right.
and the ideas and the projects, had nothing to do with doing a museum. Nevertheless, I somehow, I met with her, and my part and Rick and Charles, and convinced her somehow to, that we were interesting and then we were interested in doing this. And we got to a short list and then we got to be selected.
Hmm.
But it was, that thing, somebody took a leap of faith. There was another example where we did, this one's interesting. We did a project in a Creative Time project on 42nd Street called Soft Cell. And it was an installation, a video installation in a defunct porno theater. And the entire 42nd Street was being transformed and cleaned up and all of that.
Right.
But it was still very much in transition. And in people's minds, it was still like sort of drug trafficking, porno,
Yeah.
uh, sex industry. It was kind of, dirty and kind of slightly nasty. And we weren't prepared for the, cleaning it up was like, what's better, sort of that, which is very New York,
Right.
or some kind of sanitizing by Disney. And
Right.
we thought when we were sort of in the middle of that, and the
Yeah.
project was about that, and it was about offering these sort of impossible dreams to the public. There was a pair of lips speaking out to the street, and it was an installation. The person that was coordinating that with Creative Time, there were other artists along the street. Jenny Holzer was doing the marquees, and Rebecca Robertson, who was in charge effectively of that whole large transformation project, was went to Lincoln Center, and she was hired to coordinate all of the work to be done at Lincoln Center. At that point, it was it's kind of it was just before 9/11. And Frank Gehry had made a
Hmm.
proposal, and 9/11 sort of stopped everything in its tracks, and nothing happened there. But Rebecca Robertson asked us when they went out to look for other architects, because Frank Gehry was now out. She asked us to put in some thoughts into how we would alter 65th Street,
Mm,
because that was part of the thinking. What happens to 65th Street to sort of, and all the public spaces of Lincoln Center? So, because she loved our installation at the
I see.
42nd Street project, so she thought that, well, maybe we put some media out on 65th Street and really make the street come to life, and maybe we had some thoughts about public spaces. When it came time, and we were among 5 architects, and they were all established except us. We're
Right.
doing this
Right.
independent work, and so we made this presentation, and we went overboard. We thought about the entrance to Lincoln Center just
Yeah.
before the Metropolitan Opera off of Columbus Avenue. We had thoughts about all the plazas. We had thoughts about the street. We had lots of thoughts about it, and we put them down. We felt we had absolutely nothing to lose.
Right.
We won. And that was just insane. But before I think it was just after we won, we had the show at the Whitney, and the Whitney
Mm.
had all of these installations, and Rebecca brought the board to the show at the Whitney, and they said, "Oh my God, what did we get ourselves into? They don't have any build projects. The ICA was not built, it was just in design." And so that was the leap of faith of a
Yeah.
couple of people. And
Yeah.
I think it was a case of mistaken identity, even that
Well,
that they thought that we were qualified to do it. And in fact, because we had the opportunity, we made ourselves qualified to do it. We just
well,
did a big project.
yeah, I mean that's what I was going to say is I feel like you're selling yourself a little bit short there. And maybe and I'm struck by when you were sort of selling the ICA project that you were giving theory speak and that was not what they wanted to hear. And you've clearly built up a skill, a parallel skill. You can speak the theory, you can speak the intellectualism, but you can also speak the client. And so I'm thinking about MoMA, the Broad, the Shed, all of these large
Mhm.
projects where the city's involved, real estate developers are involved, nonprofits are involved. And there's something you can do there to get all of them on board. You can sell
Mhm.
your idea. Where does that come from? Is that from the same space as these intellectual ideas of that early work, or is this a different, a different kind of muscle that you're using there?
Um, it's probably part of that muscle, but with maturing.
Ah,
I think, when I look back, I think I speak about this in the book, or maybe not, but I've told this story before. That that proverb that genius is like
oh,
99,
right.
like 1%
Yeah,
inspiration, 99% perspiration.
yeah.
I think of that exactly in the Lincoln Center project. To be able, first of all, there were 12 constituent organizations, and you had to. It wasn't a majority rule; they had to all be aligned to
Mm,
do anything in public space. So you had to convince every single one of them. And those, constituents did not talk to one another. They
right,
may occupy the same
right.
geographical site, but they were basically competing for the same, philanthropic dollars. They were, and for tickets and so forth. They did not work together cooperatively. And so when we did this project and the project grew, it snowballed. It started small and it just grew
Right.
because everyone had the appetite to make change. And we realized that, between trying to convince, all of those constituent organizations, their boards, their managers, their general managers, and their artistic directors, And then the city had a task force on this.
Right.
There was another task force at, at the World Trade Center site,
Right.
Ground Zero site. Those were the only two projects that had city task force. So this was all the commissioners, that we had to
Yeah.
convince. And then there was the community, the community boards. Then there were the preservationists, all the organizations that were terrified that we would change anything there. And with all of that and all of, the responsibility that that carried, and all of the education that had to be done, all the educating that had to be done, I learned to speak in different tongues, really,
Mm,
because to speak to a preservationist or to speak to a donor or to speak to a community member or the city or the press, it took a very different explanation. But it's the same thing. It's just tweaked,
yeah.
to what what was the concern in their eyes and what would be the hesitation for change in their minds. And just by thinking about that, it was possible to actually deliver the same project, but in a slightly different way that made people understand why it was a good thing. And I did a lecture. I'd only delivered it once, and it's called Lincoln Center Six Ways. And I
Oh.
basically show the same 15 slides, six different times
Oh, I love
with
that.
six slightly different messages,
Yeah.
per slide. And it was, I thought that everybody would walk out, and they didn't. It was very, but I think it made really the point that um, to do that form of persuasion, and with if you really believe in something and you're passionate about it, it takes that 99%
Mm-hmm.
perspiration
Mm-hmm.
and that 1% inspiration, but that 99% perspiration is actually creative. That's
Right.
the turning
Right.
point, and that's the maturity point. I realized that all it takes to do, that to actually realize architecture in a city and to connect it to the ground and to make it permanent and to open the eyes of people, it's a creative endeavor all the way through.
This may be, I might just be asking you the same question again in
Mhm.
a different way, but I'm one of the other binaries that I was thinking about when I was thinking about this book is and thinking about your work generally is, and again, false binary. It's a lot blurrier than I'm going to make it sound. This is a bit reductive, but there is work driven by or framed by an intellectual idea. And again, I'm thinking about early work, talking about surveillance, talking about media, talking about activating a space, getting people to see something, talking about the white cube, talking about institutional critique. And then there are projects where you speak about them as a type of problem solving, as an engineering problem. And I'm thinking about the shed, which that's a very blurry project on this binary. But even something like MoMA, where when in the book the way you talk about it and when you give lectures, you talk about, oh, we were able to move the bathrooms here and then the wiring could go here when we reworked the ticket counter, so there's this float here. And that is very practical. You talk about a practical way. We're going to build the building next to it so we can hide all of this stuff under this building so the shed can have more space. Are those different sides? Do you approach projects differently depending on what you have to do? Could you talk to me a little bit about that type of language or
Yeah,
that binary?
yeah. Um, I think just to take one step back, that to because I grew up in the institutional critique time, and that's where
Yeah.
I went to school,
Yeah.
and so I was totally there, and institutions meant power. Power was bad,
Right.
and power was like the bad people were in power, and and one had to take everything apart, um, and it was really about taking things apart and throwing grenades and critiquing. It was about the critique. Architecture is generative, so it's not
Mm,
enough to be critical. You have
right.
to take that critical impulse and then figure out what you're going to do with it forward, to actually make a change. And that was another realization for me that architecture had the power to do that in a concrete way.
Mm.
So, just to answer your question now more specifically about what we think about the shed came out of the notion of there was an opportunity, there was a plot of a land that was city owned, and they were they protected it for a cultural institution, and the thinking was like they're all our cultural
Right.
institutions. Nobody brings together all the disciplines, and artists these days, even when we did that project, work across disciplines. The
Hmm.
notion of like these hard edge disciplines was had become an old-fashioned idea.
Right.
So we thought, well, what New York really doesn't have is some sort of institution, establishment that could put all the arts under one roof. And not only that, there was this other binary. There's art, and then there's like, design.
Right. Right.
And design somehow isn't an art form. And well, it is. Architecture and design are, uh, the MoMA recognized it, back in the 30s that it's one of the departments. And so okay, well, design and but how would it stay alive? Well,
Hmm.
maybe it would not just be this binary like we're art and then we're independent, autonomous from the
Right.
world. Maybe it's connected to earning money. Maybe in 2008 when we designed it and conceived it, it was a financial bust at the time economically. Just the world was combusting. And the notion of, philanthropic dollars coming into this was a little bit hard to imagine. So we thought, okay, how could it be self-sustaining
Right.
financially?
Right.
So that's when we thought that creative industry could be part of it and so forth. So this critical thinking was going into the very essence of the project, the very essence of the idea. And then we got practical, it wasn't big enough.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
that
Right.
site
Right.
wasn't big enough for this ambition, So, okay, well, maybe we make a building that borrows a piece of space from public space, maybe we could convince the city and the developer that we could open and
Right.
close this and we could have free programming and so forth. And then the opportunity to build next door, we did it out of protection for the shed because we thought, okay, and the cultural commissioner at the time was saying, well, you were given that opportunity, you might as well do it and control, what your neighbor.
Hmm.
You could
Hmm.
control your neighbor. And so we thought, okay, we'll do it, out of self-preservation. We don't want anything awful next to us. But then we decided to be opportunistic, like we needed even more
Right.
space.
Right.
So why not, convince everyone to take the lower portion of, that is consistent with our building, the first 8 stories or so, and build taller. And
Hmm.
because the city was very involved in this project early on, we were able to be part of
Right.
that, because we're architects for both. Build a little higher, 8 stories higher, as long as you're that tall, what's another 8 stories? But the shed could really use the space. So it was basically, a kind of negotiation of the very pragmatics of what makes this
Yeah.
this notion, this new idea of this new institution work.
It's the pragmatics to protect the idea, to
Yeah.
protect, the initial impulse. A couple years ago, you gave an interview at the Brooklyn Rail, and you were talking about this idea of authorship, and that for you, you don't think about the studio's work as a type of authorship or a type of style. You said it's connected to a type of thinking. We look back at the trajectory of our work, and it's all connected to ongoing research and itches that keep needing to be scratched. I'm wondering, you've put this book together, Architecture Not Architecture. It's the first full monograph of the studio's work. Did you learn anything about the connecting threads across your career? Do you see any new through lines between, this 40-year practice that you've built? Did it change how you think about your own body of work?
Uh, You know, because of the structure of the book, and the division between the two, the notion of separating them, which is very much against what we practice, which is all synthetic, it's all overlapping, and it's all the same. It's the same people, ideas flow from one to the other, but we deliberately separated them so that you could cross-reference. You can
Mm-hmm.
actually
Mm-hmm.
open in the book this way and look at something over there and then see,
Right.
another page that's referred to. And you couldn't do that by making one volume
Mm.
and putting it together chronologically or trying to
Right.
storytell or anything. It just didn't work. We tried. So by doing this sort of false division, we actually get much closer to the sort of,
Mm.
ping-ponging and relationship making between the projects. So, there were preconceptions already about, what we think the work was always about and what related to what. Like for example, we had this lifelong interest in visuality and the culture of vision, and that comes in all different forms. Surveillance is part of that, and that's more in the early work. But yeah, and glass and thinking contemplations on 20th century and glass. And then, like two-way systems and performing through the glass and so forth, and the sort of realization that, yeah, it's a two-way system. They're looking at you, you're looking at them. And then what happens in our post-paranoid world where everything is under watch? Maybe we perform for the camera. So those kinds of things, start to
Yeah.
seep into the work. And many of the projects that are in the architecture category are about,
Right.
seeing, framing,
Right. Right.
and uh, other notions of vision. Vision is very, very complex, right? And beyond perception. And so, blur building, for
Right.
example,
Right.
dwells on, taking away that sense out of our five senses so that we are now dependent on sound and smell and touch and the work carries on to framing uh, at the ICA, for example, just that little bit of water,
Mm.
and to
Mm-hmm.
decontextualize the site and just look at the harbor by just
Mm-hmm.
looking at that patch of water. And so, and all of our installations now about just the one-to-one relationship between a piece of art and and or even a wall
Yeah. Yeah.
in a museum, and a viewer and a spectator. So it's a long-winded answer to your question, but we realize that beyond the obvious things that are on our mind all the time, tourism, visuality, domesticity, relations of power. There are other things that actually, wow, we did, the book actually pointed out that there were connections that we didn't make. Like we didn't intend to have a water obsession. That was one of the
Ah.
categories. We did so many projects about water, and I didn't even realize that we were interested in water.
I love that.
But the Blur building is,
Yeah.
made of
Yeah.
water. And, there was a project that we made where we froze,
Oh, right.
water, cubes of water that were made of distinct waters, commercial waters, and religious waters and so forth. And, the ICA is about water. And so many of our projects, that somehow are, and continue to be about thinking about water as a medium. And so, Lincoln Center, just the opportunity to do a fountain there that we wanted to shape the jets of water into like a flat pancake that would hover in the air for a
Mm-hmm.
split second before it came down. That was an
Yeah.
obsession, that we
Yeah.
wanted to do something with water. So look, in answer to your question, yes, there were many discoveries that were made in making the book and then figuring out how to point to other things. These in the book we have these what's called a manicule. That's like a hand that's pointing to
Yep.
something to go over there. And so when you look at projects, and you may want to look at them, through alphabetic, you may want to look at a project that or you may want to just look at the chronology, or you may want to look at it typologically. You may be interested in a museum. And then it points you to another place in the other volume. And then you sort of
Right.
see
Right.
connections. But, there are some that are very obvious, like, the Highline and My Long Opera.
Yeah.
Those are,
Yeah. Yeah.
My Long Opera came from the fact that we did the Highline, not just the place, but the contemplation in a post-occupancy period of what we did and what came out of it.
I'm tempted to ask you more questions about water, but I know you're short on time and have to run in a second. And so my last question, I want to zoom out a little bit and just talk about architecture generally for a second. I'm thinking about the era when you started, and this is the era of paper architecture. I'm thinking about Daniel Libeskind at Cranbrook at the time. You already mentioned Peter Eisenman and the Institute of Architecture and Urban Studies. There was this general anti-practice mentality at the time. There was you already said when you started, architecture was seen as intellectually bankrupt. John Haydick was saying like he didn't want you to become architects. So many of those people, Libeskind, Peter Eisman, you and Rick, have gone on to build and build a lot. You are in architecture now. One piece we didn't talk about is you've been teaching throughout all of this too. How do you think about architecture practice today? When you talk to your students, what do you say? How do you describe what you can do as an architect today? How has practice changed from when you started to
Yeah.
what it is now?
I think in the era when architects that were part of the resistance to professional architecture became architects and started actually realizing things on the surface of the ground, and in the ground, that the institutional heads had changed. That was
Mm.
a big change,
Right.
So in the Boston ICA, for example, there was the woman that selected us, the director, Jill Medvedow, was roughly my age, and
Mm.
she was quite accomplished. And she went from being a curator to being a director to being a director of a major museum, and therefore like who was the man, it
Right.
was
Right.
it was so there was less to critique, there was still a lot to critique, but it became a really a kind of interesting dialogue to move institutions forward. We were
Yeah.
very lucky to intersect the Bloomberg administration because they were so enlightened, around culture and
Hmm.
public space,
Right.
and we were
Right.
able to realize things that we could have never dreamt to realize. So I think that the times had changed. It was the right time, the right place. And, we had these amazing opportunities that we were beneficiaries of the time. And actually, post 9/11, there was this great interest in like civic work,
Right. Right.
and everyone just, like working together, understanding that you're part of a city and working on the city. So when I talk to students today, they want the shortcut to success. And I tell them, just do stuff,
Right.
do stuff, fail, pick yourself up, do stuff, try to do things in public space, try to, if you don't have a site, steal it, borrow it for a moment, just,
Yeah.
and do competitions, get your name out there, make a portfolio of your independent work, even if you're working to support yourself and pay the rent.
Yeah.
And I just encourage students to pursue a career that they may not even understand what the boundaries are, but there's a voice. What I'm doing, all I'm doing when I teach is I just try to brainwash them a little bit, I try to, take
Right.
what's already established and encrusted about architecture and what they think, is probably, they probably have to rethink all of that, and then I put them on the spot and then I learn with them. And that's my key to teaching.
I think that's such a nice way to wrap this up. Liz, this was such an honor for me. Congratulations on the book. It was really nice to talk to you about how you think about all this work. Thanks for being on the program.
Thank you, Jared. It was fun to talk.
That was my conversation with Elizabeth Diller of Diller Scofidio and Renfro. Their new monograph is called Architecture, Not Architecture, and it is now available for purchase from Phaidon. This episode was recorded on February 10th, 2025. Our theme music is by Jeremiah Chu. The show is funded thanks to the generosity of listeners like you. If you like what we're doing, I hope you consider supporting us and get some bonus content each month. You can follow us across social media at Surface Podcast, and you can listen to all of our previous episodes wherever you get your podcasts and at our website, scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.